They came as prisoners, but female German POWs in Texas fell in love with cowboys and never went home. Summer of 1943. The Texas sun burned white across endless fields of wheat and mesquite. A convoy of military trucks moved slowly down a dirt road, their tires raising clouds that shimmered in the heat. Inside, a group of women sat in silence, their faces pale from the long journey across the ocean, their eyes fixed on a land that felt impossibly foreign. They were prisoners of war, German nurses, clerks, and auxiliaries captured in North Africa and sent halfway around the world. Outside, ranchers stopped their work to watch the convoy roll by. They had never seen German women before, let alone in military uniform. Barbed wire glinted in the distance, marking the perimeter of Camp Hearn, one of dozens of POW sites scattered across Texas. To the Americans, it was just another camp. To the women inside, it would become something else entirely, a place where war's harsh lines began to blur under the wide western sky. Because here, in captivity, some hearts refused to obey orders. By 1943, the United States was no longer just fighting a war across oceans. It was also housing its enemies within its own borders. When Allied forces captured thousands of German soldiers and auxiliaries in North Africa, a new problem emerged: where to keep them. Britain was already crowded with camps, and shipping captives back to a bomb-scarred Europe was too dangerous. America, with its vast open spaces and secure distance from the front lines, became the logical answer. Under the Geneva Convention, the U.S. agreed to treat prisoners humanely, with proper food, shelter, and medical care. So the War Department built more than 500 camps across the country, from California deserts to the pine woods of Louisiana. Texas, with its mild winters, abundant farmland, and railcon, actions became the heart of that network. Dozens of compounds appeared almost overnight near towns like Hearn, Mexia, and Camp Swift outside Austin. At first, locals were uneasy. Newspapers warned that Hitler's soldiers were coming to live among them. Rumors spread that Nazi saboteurs would escape, that the Germans would burn crops or poison wells. But the government reassured citizens that each site was surrounded by double fences, guard towers, and armed patrols. And there was another reason Texans tolerated the camps: labor. The war had pulled millions of American men overseas, leaving fields unharvested and factories short-handed. German prisoners became a temporary solution. They were paid a small wage, in Camp Script, to pick cotton, cut timber, or can vegetables. It was legal under the Geneva rules, and soon farmers began to depend on them. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Enemy soldiers were now helping feed the Allied home front. Among the thousands arriving were a few hundred women, mostly auxiliary personnel attached to the Luftwaffe or medical units, captured in Tunisia or Sicily. They were processed through East Coast ports and sent inland under heavy guard. Many spoke little English. Their train ride to Texas lasted days,
crossing endless plains that looked nothing like the Europe they'd known. To them, it felt like exile to another planet. Camp Hearn, one of the first large installations, became a model for the rest. It sprawled over 300 acres and housed up to 5,000 prisoners. Barracks lined in perfect rows, a small hospital, a canteen, even a theater built from scrapwood. The Army encouraged discipline, but permitted a surprising amount of autonomy inside the wire. Prisoners organized classes, orchestras, and soccer leagues. They painted murals on walls and printed their own newsletters. For the women, far fewer in number, life was quieter, but equally regimented. They cooked, cleaned, worked in camp hospitals, and sometimes stitched uniforms for the guards. The guards themselves were mostly older reservists, or men unfit for frontline duty. Many were Texans who'd grown up on ranches or small farms. They were stern, but not cruel. After all, these Germans were thousands of miles from any battlefield. Over time, the routine softened. Guards chatted with prisoners through the fence. Locals brought leftover produce from markets. Small kindnesses slipped past the regulations. A cup of coffee here, a newspaper there. What began as suspicion slowly turned into curiosity. The Texans found the Germans polite, educated, sometimes even charming. The Germans, meanwhile, were astonished by the abundance of food and the absence of fear. Compared to the bombing raids and shortages back home, life behind American wire felt almost merciful. The female POWs noticed something else: the freedom of the Texas landscape. Even confined, they could see for miles. Wide skies, red sunsets, and the slow rhythm of ranch life beyond the fence. Some began to exchange letters with locals through approved mail channels. Church groups sent them hymn books. Teachers offered English lessons. These small gestures planted something dangerous to military order, but deeply human: connection. In a land meant for captivity, a quiet understanding was forming. And as more months passed, that understanding would grow into something the War Department had never planned for: affection. As the months passed, the POW camps of Texas evolved into miniature societies, fenced towns with their own rhythms, customs, and unspoken rules. The female prisoners, though few, became a quiet presence that changed the atmosphere inside the wire. They formed small groups for support, sewing together scraps of cloth into dresses, exchanging recipes, and writing diaries that captured their isolation. Some had lost brothers or fiancés on the front lines. Others still believed Germany would win. Yet the longer they remained in Texas, the more that certainty faded beneath the weight of distance and time. Life in these camps followed a rigid schedule: reveille at dawn, roll call, work assignments, meals in the mess hall, lights out by 10. But between those lines of military order, moments of humanity appeared. A violin played softly in a barrack. Someone read Goethe aloud under the dim glow of a single bulb. The Red Cross delivered parcels filled with chocolate, soap, and coffee, small luxuries that made captivity bearable. On Sundays, church services were allowed, and even the guards sometimes attended, sitting quietly in the back. Beyond the fences, the local townspeople were slowly learning that these prisoners were not the monsters propaganda had painted. They were ordinary men and women caught in an extraordinary war. At first, the U.S. Army kept strict distance between locals and POWs, but as farm labor shortages worsened, many camps began loaning prisoners to work on nearby ranches. Under supervision, they picked cotton, chopped wood, repaired fences, and loaded hay bales. It was during these work details that Texans and Germans began to talk, cautiously at first, then with genuine curiosity. The women, often assigned to less strenuous tasks like cooking or clerical work, found themselves in closer contact with civilians than the male soldiers did. They met American nurses, Red Cross volunteers, and local families who brought food to the gates. For some Texans, curiosity turned into empathy. The prisoners were far from home, thousands of miles from their families, and the harsh Texas climate tested them as much as confinement did. Newspapers began running small, curious stories about the camps. One reported that German POWs were building furniture for local schools. Another described how prisoners painted murals on their barrack walls, showing peaceful countryside scenes, green meadows, church steeples, and rivers like the ones they had left behind. A few even started language exchanges, German for English, a trade made through wire fences and smiles. At Camp Hearn, Christmas 1943 brought an unexpected sight. The prisoners decorated their barracks with handmade ornaments, fashioned from tin foil and colored paper. They built a small wooden nativity scene and an America, and Chaplin agreed to let them sing carols. When the voices of Stille Nacht drifted into the Texas night, the guards stopped and listened. For a brief moment, enemy and captor shared the same silence, both thinking of home. These interactions, though seemingly innocent, worried U.S. military officials. The War Department feared that kindness could breed sympathy, and sympathy could blur loyalty. Official memos reminded officers that these were still enemy combatants. Yet, deep in rural Texas, far from the front lines, such boundaries were harder to maintain. Among the few female prisoners, bonds began to grow beyond the wire. When local ranch families invited them to help during harvest seasons under guard supervision, some were surprised by the warmth they received. Farmers offered cold lemonade during breaks. Wives shared recipes and conversation. To the Texans, the young German women didn't look like enemies. They looked like daughters, nieces, or neighbors. In letters later found in archives, some women described Texas as both a cage and a refuge. One wrote, "I was captured in Tunisia, and now I live among people who treat me as human again." Another recalled how the open sky gave her comfort after months of fear. Red Cross delivered parcels filled with chocolate, soap, and coffee, small luxuries that made captivity bearable. On Sundays, church services were allowed, and even the guards sometimes attended, sitting quietly in the back. Beyond the fences, the local townspeople were slowly learning that these prisoners were not the monsters propaganda had painted. They were ordinary men and women caught in an extraordinary war. At first, the U.S. Army kept strict distance between locals and POWs, but as farm labor shortages worsened, many camps began loaning prisoners to work on nearby ranches. Under supervision, they picked cotton, chopped wood, repaired fences, and loaded hay bales. It was during these work details that Texans and Germans began to talk, cautiously at first, then with genuine curiosity. The women, often assigned to less strenuous tasks like cooking or clerical work, found themselves in closer contact with civilians than the male soldiers did. They met American nurses, Red Cross volunteers, and local families who brought food to the gates. For some Texans, curiosity turned into empathy. The prisoners were far from home, thousands of miles from their families, and the harsh Texas climate tested them as much as confinement did. Newspapers began running small, curious stories about the camps. One reported that German POWs were building furniture for local schools. Another described how prisoners painted murals on their barrack walls, showing peaceful countryside scenes, green meadows, church steeples, and rivers like the ones they had left behind. A few even started language exchanges, German for English, a trade made through wire fences and smiles. At Camp Hearn, Christmas 1943 brought an unexpected sight. The prisoners decorated their barracks with handmade ornaments, fashioned from tin foil and colored paper. They built a small wooden nativity scene and an America, and Chaplin agreed to let them sing carols. When the voices of Stille Nacht drifted into the Texas night, the guards stopped and listened. For a brief moment, enemy and captor shared the same silence, both thinking of home. These interactions, though seemingly innocent, worried U.S. military officials. The War Department feared that kindness could breed sympathy, and sympathy could blur loyalty. Official memos reminded officers that these were still enemy combatants. Yet, deep in rural Texas, far from the front lines, such boundaries were harder to maintain. Among the few female prisoners, bonds began to grow beyond the wire. When local ranch families invited them to help during harvest seasons under guard supervision, some were surprised by the warmth they received. Farmers offered cold lemonade during breaks. Wives shared recipes and conversation. To the Texans, the young German women didn't look like enemies. They looked like daughters, nieces, or neighbors. In letters later found in archives, some women described Texas as both a cage and a refuge. One wrote, I was captured in Tunisia, and now I live among people who treat me as human again." Another recalled how the open sky gave her comfort after months of fear. Language was both a barrier and a bridge. The women practiced their English using old grammar books and American newspapers. Locals taught them simple phrases in return. Howdy became a word that made them laugh. One prisoner later wrote that she had learned more about kindness in Texas than in all her years of war service. The moral question was unavoidable. Could affection exist between enemies without betraying loyalty? To some Americans, it was harmless curiosity. To others, scandalous. The Army's official stance was strict neutrality. Guards were warned against fraternization under threat of court-martial. But feelings don't follow regulations. There were cases where soldiers slipped extra rations to prisoners or lingered a few moments longer at the gate to talk. For the women, these small acts were lifelines. They reminded them they were still human, not symbols of a collapsing regime. Letters later recovered from the camps tell of growing emotional connections. One woman wrote, "He was kind. He looked at me not as a prisoner, but as a person." Another described her shock at seeing an American soldier remove his cap in respect after she finished a hymn. The cultural differences fascinated both sides. Texans shared stories of ranch life, of wide open land and hard work under the sun. The Germans, raised in cities or tight-knit villages, were astonished by the informality of it all, the open laughter, the lack of strict hierarchy. Some even admired the American sense of optimism, so different from the exhaustion that had defined Europe. Over time, the war began to feel distant. News from Europe came slowly, filtered through censored radio bulletins and Red Cross messages. The women followed the headlines, Stalingrad, Normandy, the fall of Rome, with growing unease. The country they had once served was unraveling, and the ideology that had once seemed unshakable was collapsing. In contrast, Texas seemed untouched, a place where life still moved with rhythm and purpose. That contrast deepened their emotional conflict. They were supposed to dream of going home. Yet home now meant ruins, hunger, and a defeated nation. Here, even within barbed wire, they felt safe. The air was warm, the people kind, and the men who guarded them no longer seemed like enemies. The seeds of affection that had been quietly planted were beginning to grow. While the human side of the story unfolded quietly in smiles and glances, another, more official side was beginning to notice. The War Department received reports that relations between local citizens and German prisoners have grown too informal. Commanders reminded officers that fraternization was prohibited. Yet in places like Camp Hearn and Camp Swift, the reality was harder to control. The camps were small towns of their own, and human emotion, unlike barbed wire, couldn't be contained. The military's perspective was practical. German POWs were valuable labor, and under the Geneva Convention, had to be treated well. But if relationships crossed into intimacy or sympathy, the propaganda narrative at home could falter. The U.S. had worked tirelessly to portray its enemies as dangerous and cruel. Stories of German women laughing with Texas cowboys didn't fit that script. Still, the Army could only do so much. In rural Texas, isolation meant oversight was limited. Guards rotated frequently, and the sheer scale of the POW system, over 400,000 Germans held in America, made strict enforcement impossible. There were different kinds of affection blooming in those camps. Some were soft and silent, glances, songs shared through the fence, or words written in broken English. Others were more daring, There were instances of women sneaking short notes through guards, or American farmhands slipping small gifts, a ribbon, a piece of chocolate, a photograph. Most of these gestures never became public, but a few, later uncovered through letters and local memories, blossomed into genuine love stories. One such story surfaced decades later in the archives of the Texas Historical Society. A young German woman named Anneliese, captured as a Red Cross nurse, was assigned to a field hospital near Austin. There she met a Texan medic, a quiet man who treated her with respect rare for that era. Over months, they exchanged words while working side by side. When the war ended and repatriation orders came, she wept openly. 2 years later, she returned to Texas as a civilian, not as a prisoner, and married him in a small church surrounded by locals who still remembered her kindness. Stories like Anneliese's were not isolated. In many towns near POW camps, local folklore began to speak of the German girls who stayed behind, who became teachers, nurses, or farmers' wives. Though records remain incomplete, historians estimate that several dozen marriages between German POWs, male and female, and Americans were registered after the war. Each one was a quiet act of defiance against hatred. The German authorities, however, did not see it that way. In post-war Europe, fraternization with former enemies was condemned as shameful. For women especially, returning home pregnant or engaged to an American was often met with hostility. Some who went back to Germany found themselves ostracized, labeled traitors to their nation. Others never returned at all, choosing instead to begin anew under the same vast skies that had once imprisoned them. Back in Texas, these unions became small but powerful symbols of reconciliation. For the local townspeople, they were proof that kindness could bridge the deepest divides. American newspapers ran human interest pieces about love born behind barbed wire. Most of these articles treated the stories with surprise rather than scandal. In the eyes of many Texans, the Germans had worked hard, behaved honorably, and shown gratitude. Their women, in particular, embodied humility and resilience that struck a chord with the post-war American spirit. From a moral standpoint, these relationships challenged the black and white simplicity of wartime ideology. They forced both sides to reconsider what it meant to be an enemy. The war had taught nations to dehumanize. The camps in Texas did the opposite. Every shared meal, every act of mercy, chipped away at propaganda's armor. Even military chaplains noticed the change. One chaplain from Camp Swift later wrote, "I saw the Lord's work most clearly, not in sermons, but in the way these people looked at each other, no longer as flags or uniforms, but as souls." It was a sentiment that reflected a deeper shift, one that quietly prepared the ground for future reconciliation between America and Germany. Yet beneath this tenderness lingered unease. The U.S. Army continued to monitor its guards closely, issuing new orders forbidding excessive familiarity. The war wasn't over yet, and Washington feared that stories of compassion could be twisted by the Axis for propaganda. For the German women, any relationship with an American soldier or civilian could invite suspicion from their own superiors within the camp. Still, even with risks on all sides, the emotions persisted. Love letters passed through censors disguised as generic correspondence. Flowers were smuggled inside Red Cross parcels. Prison gates, meant to keep people apart, sometimes became meeting points at dusk, where two hands brushed for only a second before separation. To the participants, these were not acts of rebellion. They were reminders of humanity. After years of bombings, fear, and death, these women found in Texas something that transcended uniform or nationality: dignity. The fences remained, the guards patrolled, and the war raged on across the ocean. But inside that wire, something stronger than politics was quietly rewriting the narrative of victory and defeat. The stage was now set for what no one could have foreseen: the end of the war, the forced separations, and the impossible choice between returning home or staying with love born in captivity. By the spring of 1945, the war that had carried these women across oceans was collapsing in on itself. Berlin was surrounded. Hitler was hiding in a bunker, and the Reich's radio broadcasts had turned from triumph to despair. In Texas, the prisoners listened to the news through censored bulletins, their faces pale and silent. The women who had once worn their uniforms with pride now sat in the camp courtyards, sewing quietly, wondering what would become of them. Then came the announcement. Germany had surrendered. The war was over. The guards didn't celebrate loudly that day. They simply stood by the gates, uncertain how to face the prisoners they had come to know so well. For the Germans, there was no victory, only the strange emptiness that comes when survival feels like exile. In Camp Hearn and Camp Swift, the reactions were mixed. Some prisoners cheered, relieved that the killing was done. Others cried, not for the Führer or the lost cause, but for the families they feared they would never see again. A few of the women gathered under the trees and prayed softly in their own language, thanking God that the bombs had stopped. But soon, another wave of emotion followed. Dread. Repatriation orders were being prepared. Every prisoner would be sent back to Europe, regardless of what waited there. The camps buzzed with rumors that the Russians were taking revenge, that cities lay in ruins, that food was gone. For the women who had found kindness, routine, and even love in Texas, the idea of returning home felt unbearable. The American officers received new instructions from Washington. All Axis prisoners to be repatriated as soon as transport becomes available. Ships were already waiting at the Gulf ports, ready to carry them across the Atlantic. The Army began collecting records, photographs, and letters. Each prisoner was allowed only one suitcase. For those who had formed relationships with Texans, guards, farmers, or civilians, the final days were agony. There was no legal way to stay. Marriage between a U.S. citizen and a prisoner of war was not permitted. Some Americans wrote petitions to Congress. Others promised to find their sweethearts once the war's paperwork ended. The War Department ignored them all. At Camp Swift, a young German nurse named Hildegard packed her belongings in silence. She had met a local rancher while working at a temporary medical tent. He had brought her fruit during harvest season, and over months they had exchanged shy smiles that grew into something deeper. When her name appeared on the repatriation list, he rode to the gate on horseback and waited. Witnesses recalled that she pressed her hand to the fence and whispered something in German he couldn't understand. The guards eventually told him to leave, but he waited there until the trucks rolled out. Scenes like this repeated across Texas. On train platforms, American women waved goodbye to the prisoners they had befriended through church programs or farm work. Tears blurred the boundaries between victor and vanquished. The newspapers called it a quiet ending to an unusual chapter. For the people who lived it, it was heartbreak wrapped in dignity. When the first ships sailed out of Galveston, they carried not only thousands of German men, but also several dozen women, secretaries, nurses, auxiliaries, who had spent years behind American wire. The sea journey back was long and silent. Some kept photographs of the friends they'd made. Others clutched English dictionaries, as if refusing to let go of the language they'd begun to love. The men and women who stayed behind, those few permitted or determined to return later, faced their own battles. Bureaucracy was relentless. Even when marriages were eventually allowed, it took years of paperwork, affidavits, and government approval. Yet, a few succeeded. By 1947, the first of those camp romances had become official unions. The brides returned to Texas as free women, stepping once more onto the same soil where they had once been prisoners. Meanwhile, for those who could not come back, Texas lingered like a memory that refused to fade. In post-war Germany, many found only rubble and hunger. They wrote letters to the families they'd known in America, describing the cold, the shortages, the silence of bombed-out streets. Some of those letters were answered, some were not. For the Texans who had met them, the absence was equally haunting. They remembered the laughter, the broken English, the strange feeling of compassion that had grown in the middle of war. And as they read headlines about a divided Germany, they wondered what had become of the women they had once promised to see again. The war had ended on paper, but for them the truce was not peace. It was longing stretched across an ocean. The next chapter of their story would test whether love, born behind fences and guarded towers, could survive the weight of nations rebuilding and memories refusing to die. The summer of 1945 brought unbearable heat to the Texas plains. But inside the camps, the air was heavy for another reason: departure. Notices were posted on bulletin boards, transport lists. Prepare for repatriation. For the German women, each name called out was a reminder that their brief world of calm routine and cautious affection was ending. The fences that had once symbolized captivity were now barriers against what waited beyond, a homeland they no longer recognized. The U.S. Army's process was swift and impersonal. Each prisoner was photographed, fingerprinted, medically examined, and issued a number tag. Trains lined up at dawn, taking groups south toward the ports of Houston and Galveston. Military police supervised every step, but many of them did so quietly, without the barked orders of war. Some even carried luggage for the women, aware that this was not victory's triumph, but humanity's quiet farewell. On those long rides to the coast, the mood inside the train cars was somber. The women looked out at fields of corn and cotton one last time, memorizing the color of the sky, the vastness of the horizon. Many had no photographs, no proof they had ever been there, only memories. For a few, however, there were small tokens: a handkerchief embroidered by a Texan friend, a cowboy's old silver button, a letter folded so many times the paper had worn thin. At the docks, military chaplains offered parting prayers. One wrote in his diary that, "The prisoners we send home do not hate us. Some even thank us. The fences, it seems, kept out bitterness more than they kept them in." That sentiment, at peace, had captured something the war itself could not explain: how compassion had taken root in a place built for confinement. When the ships departed, the sea swallowed the last glimpse of America. Some women cried quietly on deck. Others stared ahead, expressionless. They didn't know what awaited them, whether their families had survived, whether their towns still stood, whether they would ever return to the country that had held them captive, yet made them feel free. Months later, in the shattered cities of Germany, their ships arrived. The contrast was brutal. Texas had been warm, open, forgiving. Germany was ruins and ration cards. Families reunited with disbelief. Some didn't recognize one another after years of separation. The women told stories of America, of orderly camps, fair treatment, and kindness from strangers, but few believed them. To a nation broken by defeat, such tales sounded like fantasy. Still, not everyone stayed. A handful of women began writing letters to Texas, to ranchers, doctors, even guards who had promised to help them return. Some of those letters reached their destinations. Others were lost in bureaucratic piles or censored by occupation authorities who distrusted any contact. For the women who returned to Germany, the adjustment was far harder. They stepped into cities reduced to ash and silence. Food was scarce, homes were gone, and the nation was occupied by foreign armies. Many were questioned by Allied authorities, their service records examined for signs of political guilt. Those who had spent years in American camps found themselves distrusted, accused by neighbors of having gone soft in captivity. Some were labeled collaborators for speaking kindly of the Americans. But beneath the rubble, letters continued to cross the Atlantic. American soldiers and Texans who had met these women during the war began writing through the Red Cross and private channels. The correspondence was hesitant at first, bound by censorship and distance. Yet it grew. Each envelope carried fragments of hope, news of harvests, births, and rebuilding. By the late 1940s, those letters became bridges. The U.S. government, overwhelmed by petitions from former POWs and Americans wishing to marry them, finally relaxed its restrictions. Through special permits and sponsorship programs, a small number of German women were allowed to immigrate. They arrived quietly, not as refugees or brides of glory, but as survivors of an impossible story. In rural Texas, their return stirred both surprise and admiration. Neighbors who had once whispered about enemy prisoners now welcomed them as wives, mothers, and members of the community. They brought with them traditions of discipline, song, and strength, and they adapted quickly to a land that had once been both prison and promise. Some opened small bakeries or sewing businesses. Others joined churches, teaching children hymns in both German and English. Their accents softened, but their memories didn't. They remembered the heat, the sound of crickets in the Texas night, and the kindness that had bridged the unbridgeable. Not a little were so fortunate. Some women who wished to return were unable to, lost in paperwork, poverty, or politics. They built new lives in a divided Germany, raising children in the shadow of a war that had cost them everything. Yet in their hearts, the memory of Texas remained untouched by time, a rare place where they had felt peace when the rest of the world was burning. Historians later called these camps America's quiet experiment in humanity. While Europe had drowned in vengeance, Texas had shown mercy. The story of those women became a small but profound chapter in post-war history, proof that compassion could survive even in the aftermath of destruction. For those who stayed in America, the war became a distant echo. But every sunset over the plains, every summer evening filled with the hum of cicadas, reminded them of a truth they could never explain fully, that sometimes captivity can set the heart free. The years that followed brought quiet transformation, both in Texas and across a divided Europe. The camps were dismantled one by one, their wooden barracks sold for lumber, their open grounds reclaimed by grass and wind, yet the memories refused to vanish. In nearby towns, people still told stories about the Germans, how they'd worked the fields, how polite they were, and how a few of them had stayed behind. In Germany, a different kind of rebuilding was underway. The women who had returned carried within them something the ruins around them couldn't destroy, a different understanding of the world. They had seen kindness from their former enemies, and that memory complicated the black and white image of post-war vengeance. Some of them became nurses, teachers, or translators, helping to bridge the gap between the old Germany and the new one, rising under Allied occupation. As West Germany rebuilt through the 1950s, diplomatic channels reopened, and letters once again began crossing the Atlantic. Some were formal, correspondence between veterans organizations or church groups, but others were deeply personal. A woman who had spent 3 years in Camp Hearn wrote to a family in Bryan, Texas, thanking them for teaching her to see humanity again. The letter was framed and kept in their farmhouse for decades. In Texas, the legacy of those years became part of local identity. Historical markers were erected near the sites of former POW camps, and old photographs resurfaced in attics, grainy black and white images of Germans working the fields, smiling beside American guards. School teachers used them to tell new generations about a time when compassion had been stronger than hatred. The stories of love that survived the war became rarer with time, but never forgotten. Those who had married Americans grew old together in quiet towns, their accents fading, but their histories intact. Many refused to talk about the war, not from shame, but from gratitude, because, to them, it had ended earlier than for most. It had ended the day they stopped seeing their captors as enemies. When the last of these couples passed away, their children and grandchildren began tracing their roots, discovering diaries written in both English and German. Some of those journals told of loneliness and longing. Others spoke of laughter under Texas skies, of camp dances, and of the kindness of strangers who became family. Historians later analyzed these accounts and called them the soft diplomacy of the human heart. Long before treaties and alliances, ordinary people had built the foundations of reconciliation, quietly, without orders, and without recognition. The relationships that had blossomed behind fences symbolized something far larger than romance. They represented a world learning to forgive itself. Even decades later, when tourists visited the old campsites, they could still sense the echoes of that paradox, a place meant for imprisonment that became a cradle of peace. Locals said the land never lost its calmness, as if the soil itself had absorbed the lessons of mercy taught there. By the late 20th century, surviving women occasionally returned to Texas as honored guests. Some visited their former camps, now open fields or museums. Standing beneath the same vast sky, they spoke softly about the days that had changed their lives. One of them said to a reporter, "We came here as prisoners, but Texas set us free, not by opening gates, but by opening hearts." Her words summarized what history books often miss, that wars end twice, once on paper and once within people. For the women who had crossed an ocean as captives and stayed on as citizens, the second ending was the one that mattered. In the stillness of Texas evenings, where cicadas sang and the sky stretched forever, they had discovered what even victory could not guarantee: peace. History often remembers the noise, the battles, the speeches, the flags, but the quiet stories, the ones that happen after the gunfire fades, are the ones that reveal who we truly are. The story of the German women in Texas is one of those. It isn't about conquest or surrender. It's about what happens when humanity survives inside the machinery of war. They came as prisoners, bound by orders and ideology, expecting hatred. Instead, they found decency in strangers, and warmth in a land they had been told was their enemy. They worked the soil, healed the sick, and learned a language that was supposed to separate them. And through small acts, a smile, a shared prayer, a letter through a fence, they rebuilt what war had tried to erase: trust. When those women went home or stayed, they carried more than memories. They carried proof that mercy can exist even when the world teaches you to hate. Texas had not only held them in captivity, it had shown them freedom of another kind, the freedom to feel again. In the end, their story is not about politics or victory. It's about the quiet revolution that begins when enemies look at one another and see human beings. The barbed wire rusted away, but the lessons remained. That compassion is stronger than fear, that kindness can outlive war, and that peace is not something signed at a table. It is something lived, quietly, one heart at a time.